Hello and welcome to Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. We've been going for 2 years now, but for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea behind the show is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. In the days before the virus, we visit our guests in their studios or workshops, but for now we're making do with the internet instead. My guest today is Gregg Buchbinder, owner of US-based furniture company Emeco. I'm going to let Gregg explain the company's history in rather more detail shortly, but suffice to say it was founded in 1944 and quickly created the 1006 chair, made out of recycled aluminium for the US Navy. The piece has gone on to become a design classic, but its story is far from straightforward. By the time he bought the company in 1998, its factory in Hanover, Pensylvania was on the verge of closing down. Buchbinder pumped its chest with a roster of high-end designers, the process starting with the launch of the Hudson chair, created by Philippe Starck in 2000. Since then, the company has gone on to work with the likes of Jean Nouvel, Gehry, Michael Young, Jasper Morrison and Nendo, to name just a few. Not only that, but it's been innovative with its use of materials too. In 2010, the company launched a new version of the Navy chair, made from 111 recycled Coca Cola bottles, finding a new use for plastic that otherwise would have been destined for landfill. Further research into the material led it to produce the On and On chair designed by Barber Osgerby, so called because it could be recycled endlessly. This is a company with a singular vision, and that belongs to Gregg. Gregg, are you there?
I am, Grant. Thank you for the nice introduction.
That's okay. Was it reasonably accurate?
It was perfect.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it. I guess the first thing to talk about is how things are in the US from your perspective at the moment. There's a combination of COVID, there's been the election, there's been a storming of the Capitol. It's been quite a tumultuous time over there.
Boy, it sure has. I think as I have had time to sort of reflect, because everything is really slowed down here. You could tell in LA, where I'm based, there's a lot less traffic on the roads, or there was really when the pandemic began, no traffic. It was eerie and everything was closed up. And then with the Black Lives Matter, it was a lot of unrest. And then with the whole election. So it's been really a very strange time in the U.S. and very maybe unsettling time, and I think I've had more thoughtful conversations with friends and family than I've ever had. It's really thought-provoking. So in some ways, I guess there's kind of a silver lining. So when I think of sustainability and environmental concerns that I have, they've kind of risen up as people have, with this pandemic, people, I think, have felt hopeless and they can't do anything. And all of a sudden, in things they can do something about, they've gone out and done it. And I think that's why we've seen so many people participate in Black Lives Matter. And I think we're seeing a lot of people participate and want to do something for the environment. There are conversations about climate change and greenhouse gases. And I think people weren't as involved with before. So I think there is some good that's coming out of this whole, crazy period.
Well, there is a generation that are growing up as activists, I think, which is interesting because I don't think my generation, when we were at university, were bothered about anything much at all. And that seems to have changed. How's the pandemic been for you personally and for Emeco, the company?
Personally, I live in a place called Alamitos Bay in Long Beach, and it's a quiet town, and it's south of Los Angeles. It hasn't changed much in that sense. I think there's more people out of the beach than there is, especially in the wintertime, because I think people are not at work. So, they're hanging out or they're out kayaking, or, I see more people active. There's people swimming. Like there's a bay I live and the whole distance around is about a 5K. That's a big swim. And there are now a lot of people doing the swim. Of course, in the wintertime, the water's gotten colder, so if there's swimmers, are usually in wetsuits. But in the summertime, it was just amazing how many people were out, and a lot more kayakers out. So in some ways, I like my little place, and it was kind of a private little place that nobody knew about. And all of a sudden, you get these kayakers that, there's a kayak rental, and there's like 30, 40 kayakers out. And in some ways, you feel like, this is my little place. But then it's really interesting because one day I saw all these kayakers out and some dolphins surfaced out of the bay. And the people in the kayak were going, whoa! It was just like, it's amazing to see these really large animals right by your little kayak, and they're completely free. And then as they rose up again, you could hear applause. It just struck me right then. There's a new appreciation that you get when you're out in nature. It made me realize, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that people are out here and they're appreciating it. And I think it will make them more aware and more concerned about taking care of it.
Well, just in terms of the business, I'm intrigued as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been able to continue manufacturing, or how does that work?
We were the governor of Pensylvania, where Emeco is located, forced all businesses to shut down for a period of time. So we had several months. We had to shut our doors. And that was really a challenging time, certainly, if you can't produce product. We're running. We're fortunate we've been able to keep all of our people employed, and it's definitely a challenging time. On the flip side, let me explain how Emeco is kind of set up. I live in LA, and that's the west coast of the US. Emeco is on the east. We're a long flight away. And 20 years ago, when I first started doing Emeco, I would go to Emeco maybe twice a month. And what I came to realize is when I would hire people, I decided, I don't really care where they live. I care about hiring the very best people. And we started to create a team, and the team was kind of based in different countries, in different states. So COVID closed us down. As a team, like our leadership team, there's 12 people. We get on a Zoom call once a week. We're all used to working at home. I mean, this is how we've always worked. But what we didn't do is we just started having these weekly calls. We had never done that before because we just always talked to each other. We would Skype each other, we'd call, but we did it individually. And when we all of a sudden, I guess just because everybody was, getting Zoom calls, and they said, why don't we have a team call? I was just amazed because all of a sudden you have everybody on the team listening to, the people from product development, the people from operations, the people from marketing, and everybody's connected, and they're all talking about the same topic from a different lens. And it made me really appreciate what an incredible team we have. I just realized we have an amazing team, and what we're doing now, in some way, first, I feel like this is the very best team I've ever had. I do think, again, from everything we talked about from the very beginning of this talk, all these things came together that it helped us become a closer team. And I think what you'll see is what we're able to produce together and launch together as a team will be significantly better than anything Emeco has ever done. As a company, I'm really excited.
What about the people working in the actual factory itself? I mean, presumably you've had to rejig how they work, be socially distant. How complicated has that been?
It's not too complicated in the sense that Emeco is a huge factory. I mean, in the old days, we would have train cars pull up into the factory. They load up like 10,000 chairs at a time, and they take the chairs to the shipyards where ships were fitted out. And there were 600 people working at the factory. Now we have 10% of that. So we have plenty of space in the sense we're spread out.
So it's roomy.
It's roomy. Yeah. And everybody is mindful. We're using, when they're together, they have a distance of 6 feet and they wear masks and everybody's washing their hands and we're eating in separate areas. But for the most part, when the craftsmen are working on their areas, whether they're bending tube or welding or grinding or heat treating, they have a very large space. So it really hasn't affected our ability to produce product.
I mean, should we talk about the company first, Gregg?
Okay.
The Electrical Machine and Equipment Company, it was founded in 1944 by Wilton Carlisle Dinges. Initially, it was looking at doing experimental antennas and jet engine parts. But subsequently, he bought some scrap aluminium and landed a meaty contract with the US Navy. The company creates the 1006, or the Navy chair. But what was the Navy's brief, and what are the characteristics of that chair?
Well, the Navy's brief was like no other brief you can believe, because they had some real stringent requirements. The constraints they had for their brief were multiple. So they needed a chair that would withstand any of the weather. So it needed to withstand the salt air out at sea. So it had to be corrosion resistant. They needed a chair that was not going to affect the instrumentation. So they needed something non-magnetic. They needed a chair that wouldn't catch on fire. Fires on a Navy ship are lethal. They needed a chair that was super strong and durable, because the sailors out at sea would destroy anything. So they had all these constraints, and they wrote some specifications. I mean, the thickness and the anodized coating and the kind of welds, and it was very, very elaborate what they needed for a product. Emeco produced something that was so good, that was so robust, that performed so well. They started making it standard issue for all warships, battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines. They even started using it in Navy hospitals and Navy prisons. So it became a very successful company back in the 40s and the 50s.
Well, I remember reading that it was used in prisons, partly because prisoners couldn't break them apart and use them as a weapon or stab anybody like they could with a timber chair.
Well, yeah, and we'll talk about that. And part of it is, in order to make this chair so good, it had to go through a very elaborate process. The process, you end up with a chair with absolutely no connection. So there's no screws or bolts or anything to dismantle it. So you end up with this solid piece of aluminum that's just so strong. So that's kind of how it got there. But, to make the material at the time, or to make the chair at the time, there wasn't enough aluminum available. The aluminum was going to making aircraft and other kinds of war products, and there was scrap drives in America, and Americans felt patriotic, so they were contributing glass and paper and aluminum, and from this aluminum, 80% recycled aluminum goes into this chair, and with this process, it's a 77-step process, you end up with something that was tested to last 150 years. It's really extraordinary, and it's kind of, that heritage is something we look at today. So that Navy chair, that 1006, it's kind of the bar we look at for anything we produce.
So the recycling element was kind of practical rather than philosophical in that sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned the 77 different processes. Obviously, I don't want to talk about all 77 here and now, because we'll be here for some time. But maybe can you give us an overview of how you manufacture a chair?
So the aluminum comes in our back door, and it comes in sheets, and it comes in extruded tubes. And the aluminum we get it zero temper. That's soft. The molecules are spread apart, and it will bend fairly easily. That allows us to go into the first area and bend the tube so it bends smoothly, so it won't crack, it won't dent. So if you look at an aluminum chair from Emeco, the curves are all very smooth. Then we take the parts and it goes over to welding. And we TIG weld. So there's a rod in one hand and a torch in another hand. And these craftsmen will weld the chair basically together. The welds are then taken to an area called grinding. The guys have a grinding wheel, and they grind the big welds. They grind the majority of the weld off so it's smooth. Then when we weld this soft aluminum, there's hard spots created because the molecules will harden in those areas where we've welded. So in order to make the molecules uniform throughout the whole chair, we take the chair and we put it in a hot boiling salt bath. It's around 957 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what centigrade is. And it's to the point where the aluminum almost melts. It softens it up. The molecules get realigned. It's then taken into cold water. It's quenched. And the molecules it's like a nail going through a board, and it sort of takes it from zero temper to T4. So it goes to soft to semi-hard. And in that stage, we're able to take the chair and make sure everything's aligned, make sure the legs are straight, make sure everything is just how we want it. And then we put it into an aging oven overnight at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And in 8 hours, it ends up going to T6 in hardness. Now it's fully hard like a mountain bike frame. So it's a super hard frame. Then we hand finish it with a Sanaflex machine. It's a machine that puts the brush finish on all the areas. Then it goes into anodizing. That's an oxidizing of the outside layer. It's a hard coating, so it's as hard as diamonds when it's done. It's durability in any kind of weather condition. So those are the main processes that it goes through.
It sounds like there's an awful lot of handwork. You're looking at industrial craftsmen making this product. Has that process changed since it was first designed? Hasn't
changed at all. You know, it's interesting because as Emeco competes with a lot of different kinds of chairs, nobody puts this kind of work into a product. Emeco is a maker, and inside of Emeco's, under one roof, we have all these different departments that do all this work, and it's a lot of work, and it's time-consuming, and it's expensive. A chair that's injection molded takes, 3-4 minutes to make. An Emeco chair could take 2 to 4 hours to make. It's very hard with that kind of labor to compete with a chair that is just stamped out of, injection mold out of plastic. It's always been on my mind, how can we make this process quicker? How can we cut steps out of the process? And it's really the people that created this process back in the day of Wilton Dingus, who was an engineer. It's a chemistry situation. The material, the alloy of the aluminum, all these things were consideration. I mean, aluminum has about 7 different kinds of alloys, the 1000 series through 7000 series. And different alloys are good for different purposes, for welding, for anodizing, for heat treating. And so when these guys set up the process, they took this into consideration. So aluminum alloys, it's got silicone and magnesium and all these other chemicals that go into it, and the percentages change depending upon the use. So what I have discovered over the years is all the steps are critical. The chair that's made today is identical to what it was made like back in the 40s, with a slight exception. Couple things. One is the welds. When we started to ship the chairs to architects and designers, would do it for a restaurant or a hotel, and they'd get these chairs and they'd see the welds were kind of a little bit clunky. We have since smoothed them out. That's one thing that's changed. So you'll see a really old original Emeco chair, and the welds will be a lot more noticeable. And the other thing is, actually it was with Terence Conrad. He used our chairs in one of his restaurants in London, and he contacted us and he said the chairs are marking up the floors. And the oldest chairs we had in the day, they had neoprene glides that were made for Navy ships, and they would kind of keep the chairs from sliding when the ships would roll. But they were black neoprene, and they would mark up floors. So we have changed the glides since that time so they don't mark up people's floors.
Right. The company has this hugely successful chair that you've talked about how it was made, but then things begin to go wrong. So what happened?
Well, the biggest thing that happened is the Cold War ended and the Navy stopped buying chairs. And not only did they stop buying chairs, when they would bring Navy ships in and mothball them, they'd keep the chairs because the chairs were made so well, they'd last so long, they really didn't need more chairs. So that was a huge problem. And really Emeco they made a few different versions, but basically the 1006, the Navy chair, was their product.
Well, then your father buys the company in 1979. So what did he see in it, Gregg? I think he'd come across the company before while he was doing some work with the Navy. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Originally, my dad was an engineer, and he opened up a little welding shop, and he had one employee. And when we were kids, we got to play around in the shop and play with the tools, and it was kind of a cool thing. And he worked with companies doing understructures and doing metal structures for different kind of projects. He even did, there was a company here, Herman Miller, and he did prototypes for them. So some of the prototypes were for Charles Eames. So I grew up in a house full of old rejects and stuff that are now prototypes, but they'd go to a trade show and they'd give my dad all these chairs, or he'd have these projects. I remember in the garage, we had all these fiberglass shell chairs with the rubber mounts he needed to find an adhesive that would keep them glued on. And he had all these clamps and all these other things. So we had a house full of kind of very interesting chairs at the time. So he was exposed and knew about furniture, and he was doing a project for the U.S. Navy, and he was making metal stanchions that would weld down to the deck, and they'd put chairs on top of the stanchions and the tabletops, and they would be like for the mess hall. So again, as the ship would roll, all that furniture was welded down to the deck. And one of the companies that was a client of his built out ships, and they had one of their suppliers was Emeco, and they really needed the aluminum chairs, and Emeco at the time was not doing well, and Emeco was going out of business. And so they contacted my dad to see if he'd be interested in trying to keep this thing going. He took me out to Emeco. So when I was like 22 years old, I got to see Emeco for the first time.
Well, I was interested in that because you were leaving college at about the time that he bought the company.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that timing gave you a special interest in Emeco.
What gave me a special interest wasn't that really, but was my mom always had like design magazines, and she did interiors, and she was a painter and did art, and she'd have these, Italian design magazines. And I remember looking through her magazines and seeing, it was like Domus magazine, and I saw at the time, I learned who Ettore Satsas was, and he was doing Esprit stores, and he had done some like beautiful yachts in people's homes, and he was putting those chairs in them. And when I saw that as a kid, that I thought really cool because, Emeco, it was a military contractor. That's what they were. They weren't a cool company. They were just, they made this product. So what intrigued me mostly was that it looked beautiful in some of these installations, and it was just, I thought it was great. And so when I got to go to the factory, it was real eye-opening to see how elaborate this process was to make it, and really a true appreciation for what these craftsmen, their skills.
Can we talk about your background? Because you got a degree in business, but did you have a plan, I wonder? Were you always going to join your family firm? Surfing seems to crop up quite a lot in your childhood from all the clippings I've read, Gregg.
Well, not only did it crop up, it was funny because my dad, I remember when I was young, I grew up in Huntington Beach, and so we lived in this area where it was a little island, and I would take my surfboard and I would paddle across from our island to the next island, and then paddle across to the beach side, and I'd surf every morning. And that beach is right where Sunset Beach meets Huntington Beach. There's a little place there where I'd surf every morning. That was where I thought I'd want to open up a surfboard shop. I'll surf every morning, I'll make surfboards, and I'll do that. So my dad would talk to me about that, and so that was my big vision in life. I would be, I'd surf and I'd have a surfboard shop. So that was, my background. And I ended up going to college, and, I took business classes. I really enjoyed design and art, and I always took as my fun classes were always, drawing or color or anything involved with design was my real interest.
It seems, reading your story, that there are kind of two key men in your life and career. One is Philippe Starck, and the other was your father. And we'll get on to Starck shortly, but can we just spend a bit of time on your father? Because you've described him as my mentor, a charismatic leader who saw a positive side to everything. You bought Emeco from him eventually in 1998. What was the financial state of the company by that point?
Oh, at that time, it was losing a lot of money every year. So it wasn't something he was able to really afford to keep going. But I came to the factory that year, and I had walked through the factory, and it was in really poor condition, and the roof was leaking, and it was a skeleton crew, and people were pretty dispirited and wondering when the company would close.
I mean, how much debt are we talking? Can you tell us?
It was losing about $500,000 a year.
Right. Okay.
It was just getting buried in debt. So, we were at a point where suppliers weren't getting paid. And it was funny because I had walked into the front office after walking through the factory, and there was a Russian woman on the phone, and she said, "No, we will not ship your chairs. You send us the money first." And, they needed the money to pay the payroll, and, hung up the phone. And I said, "Paulina, who was that?" And she said, "Oh, some guy, Giorgio Mani." And I was going, God. And I started looking through the file cabinet, and I started to see, that's when I realized people like Terence Conran had discovered Emeco. And, that was when I thought, this is a cool company. And if we can refocus the efforts on not the U.S. Navy, but on architects and designers, I think there's potential for this company.
Mm. And what did your dad make of your plans?
He, again, he was a supportive guy, but, again, it was a situation where he felt like, it's a very large factory, and when you have to heat it in the wintertime and keep it going, it's expensive to keep it going. So it's very difficult, and also faced with, we had a chair that was very expensive to make, and as every year the market would get more and more difficult to compete, and price has always become tougher and tougher. He thought it was a very difficult road, but I was at a point in my life that it was, it was a challenge. I was ready to take it on.
And did you argue over it, or was he always supportive?
We definitely, we argued, but on weekends we would get together, and we used to ride our bikes down Pacific Coast Highway, from his house in Huntington Beach down to Laguna Beach, and with a group of friends, and have a cappuccino. So that was like one of our favorite things to do on weekends. So we had a very great relationship, but it was also, when it came to work, we were both determined, and we were very similar people.
Mm. Mm. And then there was this horrendous accident, Gregg. I hope you don't mind talking about this, in 2002, when you were both riding on a tandem and you were hit by a car. You broke your neck, and your father, who was only 69 years old, died. I mean, it must have been horrendous. It was
a very, very difficult time in my life. It was, I'd lost someone that I cared dearly about, and the circumstances were very difficult. So it took me a long time to kind of get past that and go on.
Did it change the perception, I mean, both of your life in general, but also of the company, I wonder?
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I don't know how other people perceived it, but there was a point in time where I was in the hospital and I had a halo on my head. This thing, if you look at my head, I still have some scars in my forehead where this thing is bolted into your head, and it's to hold your head straight so that the bones could heal. Super painful thing. But I realized at the time that, I had been traveling all over the place, and, we had started to sell chairs in other countries, and I had distributors I was setting up in Europe, and I'd meet Philippe Starck in different places, and I realized, God, I'm going to probably not be able to travel so much. And it was funny because right about that time we had a installation that was in Frank Gehry's offices for, I don't know, it was like 120 Philippe Starck's Hudson chairs for his offices. So I had gone down to his offices because, I was curious what they were using the chairs for, number one. And number two, I also was like, boy, wouldn't it be cool if we can work with someone like Frank Gehry on a chair? And so partly being in the hospital bed and being laid up, it's got me thinking about what I can do more on a local basis.
Interesting. I mean, the other person that kind of came into your life a few years before that was Starck, and I think it's important that we talk about him. I was at the European launch of the chair that you produced together in 2000, the Hudson. It was a breakfast in Milan, as I recall. I was editing a magazine called Blueprint at the time, not particularly convincingly, but there you go. I have to say, I didn't come with huge expectations. I'd had a bit of a night the night before, and so I did come with a significant hangover, as I recall. But you made this fascinating couple, Gregg. I mean, Starck was obviously a veteran of these kind of occasions, and he's a great storyteller. And I remember you looking kind of quite wide-eyed at the whole thing, like it was a completely different planet you just landed in. Do you think that's a fair summation?
It's a very fair summation. was a culture shock for me. I mean, here I am, first time to Milan, and we had met in New York at the Mercer Hotel, and we're having some wine or something, and we're talking about how to launch this chair and what to do. And he said, we'll get a truck and we'll have billboards on the truck, and the truck will drive around to all the best parties. And on the billboards, we'll put a picture of the chair, and then the billboard will flip and it will say, Heritage against recycling. And heritage against recycling to me initially sounded like not such a good thing. I said, Philippe, what do you mean by heritage against recycling? He said, when you make something so well, you never have to recycle it. And that was 20 years ago, and it's so true. It's, he's such a smart guy, and he's taught me so much. And anyway, then we were going to do a press conference, and he connected me up to the right people, and we ended up having a press conference in Carla Fendi's private showroom that you were at.
That's where I was.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such an elegant place.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I remember that because it was, I was pretty nervous about the whole thing. And we had, like 100 people showing up to this press conference, and everybody's kind of waiting around for Starck to show up. And it's, he's not there. And it's like, I think it was a 9:00 start, something like that. So it was pretty early.
It was early, yeah.
And they said, where's Philippe at? And he wasn't there. And so I called him. He answers the phone. And I said, Philippe, we're about ready to start. Are you coming? And he said, what? And he was in his hotel room. And he said, fortunately, it was really close. He said, I'll be right there. And he walks in, completely no preparation, no discussions, no anything. And he just starts into his basically 1-hour lecture. I sat there and I truly was watching this guy talk about what we did and how we did it, and the sweat and the hand. And he had gone to the Emeco factory and he told our guys how much our product was appreciated, but he was so good. And as I listened to him, I learned so much about ourselves, just listening to Starck talk about what we did and why it was significant. That was really an amazing time for me. So that's where it all began. You're right, where Starck presented it.
Well, it was fascinating because, he'd increasingly be doing these one-liners in plastic, which were funny for a moment, but literally often throwaway. But this chair was, it was kind of brilliant. It was, I remember writing it was the best thing I'd seen at the fair. How did you and Starck meet in the first place? How did the Hudson begin initially?
Yeah, I was decided I needed to find customers for our chairs. And I took a Navy chair, went to New York, and I was in Soho, and I went from store to store to shop to see if anybody, the furniture people, anybody was interested. Really didn't get a whole lot of interest. And at the time was the furniture for ICFF at the Javits Center. And I went over to the Javits Center, and I was walking up and down the aisles just to check out who was there. And I had stayed at a hotel that Starck had done, the Paramount Hotel. He did it with Ian Schrager. And I did it on purpose because I saw it when I went through our books that we had shipped chairs there. And I wanted to see what it looked like. And there was a mezzanine, and there were some chairs in a cafe. And he had a slip cover over the chairs with like an axe on the back of it. And so I said, when I was walking up and down in the Javits Center and I ran into Philippe, he was walking. I said, Mr. Starck, I said, I love what you did with our chairs at the Paramount Hotel. He said, oh, what chair? I said, the Navy chair. He said, what do you do for them? And I said, well, I own the company. He said, oh, I thought it would be a bunch of old military men. And he said, I've always dreamed of doing a chair for Emeco. Would you be interested? I said, I'd be interested, but we don't have the money to pay you. And he said, no, let's sit down. Let's talk about it. And that night we sat down, and I still have the magazine that he drew all these sketches of what he had thought about. And he had drawn the Hudson chair. And, it was pretty amazing because part of our conversation was I was concerned about him taking the 1006 chair. And Starck has done some wild things and put horns on things and done things. And He said, no. He said,
he's done big garden gnomes, let's face it.
That's right. But he said, I'm going to make something even more neutral than the Navy chair, and which he did. And so the Hudson chair is just smooth back. It really has no design. But the one thing he did add is he wanted to make it polished. And we tried. And fortunately, we were close to a company called Harley Davidson. And they had guys that knew how to polish. They taught us how to take that aluminum and polish it up right. So that allowed us to really get the chairs polished. And that was a big innovation for us to learn how to polish.
And what did your team in the factory make of all this? Presumably you had staff there who'd been doing fundamentally the same thing for 30 years or something. Did they take to it?
Yeah, it was really exciting because when Starck came out, he's great. And he came out with a film crew and some French guys, and they would walk around and they would talk about things, and he had a microphone in his glasses to record what he was saying, and the whole thing was so much fun. And in fact, one of the guys, when he was retiring, I said, "What's one of your best memories of working at Emeco?" He's, the time that Phil came here. He said, that was great. And, so he told the guys how good they were and how important it was. And he said, the chair you make is the most important chair in the world. It's the best made chair that's ever been made. And he said, you guys should be very proud of the work you're doing. And I mean, to hear that from a very international French guy in this little town in Hanover, it was just interesting because we all of a sudden went from this stodgy, utilitarian, industrial producer to this very cool design brand overnight.
Being the toast of the town.
Yeah.
Subsequently, you've gone on to work with a slew of kind of big name designers, but they're very different if you look through the list. I can see a link between Nendo and Jasper Morrison, but they're completely different from Starck and, let's say, Frank Gehry. So how do you go about choosing who you're going to work with?
I wasn't very strategic at all. And of course, we had no marketing or anybody. It was all based on just chemistry and gut feel and opportunity. It was just my curiosity. I mean, to work with a guy like Frank Gehry was so exciting because he'd walk me through and he'd show me all these models and buildings they were doing. And this one man, truly a genius, who really was doing the kind of projects he was doing, and then would sit down with me and work on this chair. I felt so almost like I didn't want to take up his time because it was like so unimportant compared to the kind of things he was doing. But he said things to me like, a chair is about the hardest thing you could do. And he was pushing us towards doing things we had never done with a chair. He wanted to make the chair, he called this the super light, and he was inspired by Gio Ponte's Super Leggera. And he wanted to make the chair move. So when you sat in the aluminum chair, he wanted to move so it was comfortable. He said, so they make airplane wings move with the aluminum and buildings move with aluminum. He said, I want the chair to flex. So when you sit down, it moves with aluminum. So that was a whole new thing to do with the material. I guess the one thing that I like about working with these different people was they pushed Emeco to use and learn more about the aluminum. So we learned so much more every time we worked with someone new. They brought things to us and they challenged us.
But they are all quite big names, though, Gregg, aren't they? You're not taking a punt on somebody new, particularly.
No. Partly, so a couple things. When you're working with people like Norman Foster, he's such a technician, and engineering, was his thing, and he wanted to make the very lightest chair, the least amount of material, and the strongest possible. And we would make a chair, and we have the extrusion pretty small. And he said, let's make it smaller, make it smaller. And he got to the point where it was like, this won't be strong enough. And he said, okay, let's make the inside of the tube thicker. So visually, it looks very, very skimpy. But the internal, the invisible parts of it were stronger. Again, it pushed us to start thinking about how can we use the least amount of material in what we do? How can we leverage some of the things we do in this extraordinary process? So again, always learning something new from anybody we work with. And you get that from these guys that have done amazing things especially with aluminum. I was interested in working with people that had incredible experiences to kind of push us.
Yeah. They're quite blokey as well, I noticed on your list. I mean, it's Andre Putnam and Kim Colin, but there's a lot of beards and bald heads otherwise.
Yeah. There were, but, again, it's partly not, there was never a list of people that I wanted to work with. It was more like, an elevator ride, and you meet somebody and you start talking and you realize someone really inspires me, and I connect up, because I think I've always had this rule at Emeco: no assholes. And part of that is I like to work with people that I like. I've encouraged everybody in any area when we're hiring people, hire people that we like. And I just think it's so important to do that. And so with the designers I've worked with, I mean, we've developed really great friendships. And to me, it makes the projects fun.
I mean, I guess the next giant step you took was working with Coca Cola, which I think was 2010. The product came out, which was working on a new version of the Navy chair made from recycled plastic bottles. I mean, that came about through an introduction from Paolo Antonelli from MoMA, I believe, who's been on this show before. It's an interesting one again, because when I first heard you were doing it, and I think it was in Milan, I initially dismissed it as a bit of a marketing stunt because you get quite a few of those during that week, right? But it's interesting because when the company approached you, you initially turned them down, I think I'm right in saying.
Right. Yeah, I did. I felt the same as you did, Grant. I felt like Coca Cola, I've seen their tables and chairs and umbrellas with Coca Colas all over them. And we were, at the time, have established ourselves as a serious chair producer. And I wasn't interested in doing any promotional products. It was really interesting because I had an executive call me from Coca Cola who explained to me, he said, there's going to be billions of our bottles that end up in landfills or the ocean. It's so important for us to help people understand this material can be upcycled and made into something that is a valuable product. And we need to be able to figure that out. And that got me excited because, again, the whole idea of keeping plastic bottles out of the ocean, for me, when I see in the harbor, and I still see plastic bottles floating in the bay, it really is disheartening. And I just thought it just was really encouraging for me to think we could do something that really has a positive impact. And we've now over 70 million bottles we've kept out of landfill, just Emeco. But we've had conversations, and we get phone calls from a lot of really big brands that want to know about how to use the material and what we do and how we do it. We really learned a lot. I mean, it's funny because I was afraid of trying something new because we had no expertise in it, and people knew us for our aluminum chairs. And I just thought, this is a big jump for us. And I was really concerned about making it, but now we're kind of gotten so into it. I mean, there's things like when I see things about people always ask me, hey, Gregg, why don't you use ocean plastic? And I mean, ocean plastic and the size of islands floating in the Pacific, it sounds like you could just go out there and pick this stuff up, and it's just not that easy. I mean, using plastic that we use, we get it from reclamation centers. And we have pretty consistent supply. But even with consistent supply, making that 111 chair was very difficult. It's still way less consistent than virgin material. We had to run the temperatures way hotter. Our reject rate was astronomical. So we ended up not being very successful financially because we just had so many rejects. And also we had like blemishes in the finish because it just wastes material. At the time, I thought, well, that's part of the charm of the product. People will know that's what's so interesting and cool about it because it's made from waste. Until we had a container load of chairs rejected that we shipped to Japan because they didn't want blemishes in their chairs. And I realized at the time, we have to figure out, if we're going to be successful with this, how to mold this material so that we could mold it at lower temperatures, so we can mold it faster, so we can remove blemishes. So from 2006, when we started working with chemists and material scientists on how to really work with this and how to engineer this material.
So it took 4 years, in other words.
It took 4 years just to launch the 111. And even at that time, that material, we still kept working on it. And year after year, we kept working on it because we just needed to reduce the amount of rejects we had. And every time we had a reject, we could grind the material up and we could use a small percentage to put into the big vat of material to make the next chairs. So after about 16 years of really trying to work on that material and work on the material, we've got the material down to where it's gotten really good. But it took us a long time.
Mm. I mean, it must have been a mammoth task. Presumably the whole factory had to be retooled. Staff had to learn new skills.
Yeah. Well, we have a new type of skills too. Like our engineers, we have two incredibly talented people, and they call themselves Emeco because they're two women that run our engineering, and they're really, really good. They've learned all about tool making and injection molding, and there's not that many tools that are made in the U.S., so had to go overseas and work with different suppliers and how to work with the people in all kinds of different facets, the tool designers, the material designers. And so when Emeco's designing when someone's designing a chair, when Emeco's making a chair, it's not just what most companies do. It's not the aesthetics. It's the design of the material. It's the design of the tooling. It's the design of the process. It's the design of the packaging. All of these things go into consideration. And it's the design of what happens to it when the chair isn't needed anymore.
Yeah.
So can it be reused? Can it be recycled again? So design at Emeco is not just, a designer that we meet with. We have a whole team we build around that designer. So when we're working with someone like Barber Osgerby, we have a whole team of people who are contributing to that whole process. Certainly, Ed and Jay, they're coming up with a great visual and an idea and a concept and a way to communicate what we're doing in a really smart way. And then it takes our team to make it work.
I was interested because initially, Ed and Jay obviously did the on chair, which is made of 70% recycled plastic. And the notion is that you can take it back to you to get it recycled. So basically this thing is constantly, it can be constantly recycled. Interested initially when you started using the recycled Coca Cola bottles that you did a version of the Navy chair. That was a conscious decision. We weren't going to add new design to this. We're going to look at an old model and in a different material.
Because this project, to us, it was a project about material. It was a project that we wanted people to really think about the material we're using and not be thinking about the design. The design, it was from the 40s, and it was nothing new as far as the shape. It was all about really the material. And that was what we were really most interested in, is being able to get people to realize we can take waste plastic bottles, grind it up, and make it into a structurally sound product. That was really the goal of what we were after, what we achieved.
You also done a version of the Navy chair in solid wood, working with the local Amish community, as one does. How did that come about?
It's funny because I'm always, I hear these old stories about where the original Navy chair came from, the design. And back in the day, it was anonymous. It wasn't a designer. It was like there was a staff of draftsmen that would draw up all the chairs, and there was scientists, but there was not design wasn't really thought about as being an occupation even. And someone said there was probably an admiral. He had a favorite chair, and it was probably made of wood. And when someone said, "What shall it look like?" he just, pointed to that chair and said, "Make it look like that." That's the stories I've heard. And, when you look at the process and how difficult it is to make the Navy chair out of aluminum, you realize that it probably was made in a different material back in some days. So it was kind of a nod to originally how this chair was originally conceived and making it that way. So it was kind of a fun thing.
The Amish angle, I'm also intrigued by, Gregg. How did that come about?
It actually came about because we've got these Amish guys there's a whole community. It's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it's about 30, 40 minutes from the factory. And we started getting some interest in doing something in wood. And we did a project with Jasper Morrison where he took The recycled material we did, the WPP, the wood polypropylene, we used on Broom with Starck for the chair because he liked that material. And then the base of it was made in wood. And we asked the Amish guys if they could help us make the base part of it. And they're great. And they have the same kind of philosophy that Emeco does. Everything is really very simple, straightforward. There's no waste in their operation. They're very skilled woodworkers, and we've done other things with them. Like when we work with Nendo, they took some old barn wood and they made some seat bottoms for us for the Sioux project. It's interesting having them as our neighbors because that's very complementary to what we do and what we need them for.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, look, we're coming to the end of our time. I've taken up ages. So last couple of questions. It's quite intriguing when you read the press clippings. There are lots of companies doing knockoff versions of what you do. And you're quite vocal and quite litigious, I would suggest. This is a consciously adopted policy, I take it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've had situations where it's been rather just extreme where, there's a company in the U.S. called Restoration Hardware, and they basically published a magazine with our whole Navy collection, the Navy chairs, the Navy bar stools, the Navy chairs with arms, and rather than the Navy chair, it was called the Naval chair, and it had our history. They not only took the chair design, but they also took everything about us, and they created it. And I realized if we didn't fight fights like that, we would lose our company because they were having it made in China and bringing it over here, and it was going to be a very low cost. And visually, it looked identical, but in all those steps we talked about, they skipped, like they didn't use the heat treating process, so the chairs wouldn't last as long, and they didn't do the anodization, and a lot of things that were so important and key were left off to keep the prices down. So it was real important for us to protect it, and we have trade dress protection on the Navy chair, which is the strongest form of protection you can have. So we were in a very good position to be able to fight.
I mean, I'm always intrigued by this. It's interesting to get your point of view, really. Would you ever consider taking a different route by introducing lower entry point level pieces? I mean, Fender spring to mind. They're an example of a company where the Strat was being knocked off by the Japanese in the 80s, and it fought back by opening its own Japanese factory and did the Fender Squire series, which was cheaper than an American Fender, but still a well-made guitar that kind of introduced people to the brand with the notion that they would then want the actual, full American Fender. Is that something you'd ever consider?
Actually is what we've done. So with the 1006 Navy chair, it's all aluminum, and the 111 Navy chair, same chair, and it's made in injection molded, and it's at least half the price. And we've done it now. We did a collection with Jasper Morrison that's called 1 inch. We did it with aluminum frame and different kinds, either wood seat and back or plastic seat and back or upholstered seat and back. But then we did the same version in all plastic, which is very economical. It's our lowest cost chair, but probably one of our best chairs we've ever done from a standpoint of mass production. So yes, we've done that, Grant, and it's ironic because most people think of Emeco as being a very expensive chair company, but we do have products that are also affordable.
Very good. I have taken up ages. So final question, Gregg. Plans for the future. What can we expect from you? What's happened to Emeco House on Venice Beach? Is that open?
It's not open yet.
Not yet.
Emeco House it's a kind of a fun project, and it started off. I've been traveling a lot because we've been selling Emeco in over 60 countries, so it gave me reason to really go exploring. And I remember being in Tokyo and walking in this really cool neighborhood and seeing this old shack, and I thought it'd be so cool to have an Emeco House here where people could come and see our product and a place that I could stay. And that had always been a dream, no matter where I was traveling, whether I was in London or whether I was in Paris, and in those cool little edgy neighborhoods that are, full of designers has always attracted me. A couple years ago, my daughter's living in Venice Beach, and I was in Venice Beach, and I thought, God, why don't I do that here? Anyway, there's a little small area that's a live-work area full of creatives and filmmakers and painters, and it's just a great little area, and we're working on an old sewing shop and taking that sewing shop and creating a zero energy preservation, adaptation of all the materials, and we're doing everything that we did to make a chair. So we're considering every material that goes into this and using non-toxins and using materials that will last a long time. And it's just about completed. It'll be a place that we could come and talk about the factory. We'll have a studio downstairs, and upstairs a place for people to stay. That's exciting, and we'll be done with it in a couple months. And we've got actually later this month, a couple weeks, I think it's February 24th, we have a really great project that we're going to launch with Naoto Fukasawa, and he did something that's so very Emeco. It looks like something that probably we could have been building since the start of the company and in the 40s. And so I'm excited to share that. And he's used all of our processes and everything we're so known for.
Well, very good. That sounds very exciting. Gregg, thank you so much for your time. I have so much respect for you and everything you've done with the company. It's been a joy talking to you.
Thanks, Grant. Talk to you later. Bye.
And to discover more about Gregg and Emeco, go to emeco.net. As ever, there are images from the interviews, as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. And you can find all the podcasts that I've done, sign up to my newsletter, and lots of other stuff at grantondesign.com. Finally, and this is really important, if you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And it would make me really happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks so much for listening, and please stay safe and well.